Snow sat heavy on Bellwether, a small Vermont village in the first hard weeks of 1862, pressing roofs and fences until every shape turned simple and still. Smoke rose in straight lines from chimneys and then vanished into the low sky as if even the wind believed it should not make a sound here. St. Augustine Parish stood at the center like a dark spine through the white, its bell tower rimmed with ice and its doors breathing out a thin strip of warm light. People moved quickly between house and church, heads down, scarves frozen at the edges, and spoke of prices and the war, never of the thing they felt but could not name. The boys of the choir crossed the square in thin coats, steps matched without thinking, mouths closed against the sting, and they looked up only when the Reverend raised a hand at the doorway. Father Alastair Craik did not greet them loudly. He nodded once, soft and exact, as if every nod had a measure to keep. Inside, the nave was warmer, the air thick with candle soot and wet wool, and sound returned in careful pieces. A hymn from memory, a cough at the back, the ticks of cooling beams. He liked the ticks most, the way small noises marked the building's pulse, and he would pause during rehearsal to listen as if the church spoke back. People called him patient because he never raised his voice and never touched a child without first asking for a hand to be straightened or a shoulder to be square. He kept a small book in his coat and wrote brief notes between songs, the date, the weather, and a neat row of numbers under each boy's name, which mothers said must be a list of hymns learned. They did not see how he watched breath, not faces, how he counted the time each chest swelled and fell, how he shifted a boy 2 steps left and 1 step back, not for harmony, but for the way a ribcage opened in that place. The winter deepened. Drifts climbed like walls, and the bell rope froze into a shape that would not bend. So the tower stayed mute for days. In that quiet, the Reverend moved rehearsals later, saying, "The night makes brave singers," and he locked the church when the candles were lit, which no one thought strange because thieves travel in the dark. Outside, boots left narrow tracks that filled within an hour. Inside, the boys were told to hold a single note until the stone under their feet seemed to hum back. Sometimes a boy swayed and the Reverend steadied him by the elbow, steady as a doctor, and told him to picture a lantern and sing toward it, simple and kind. And the boy tried again. The windows showed only a smear of moon. The glass was cold enough to frost from the inside, and the colors of the saints looked drowned under it. At the rear, near the organ pipes, a low draft moved in time with the held notes, as if the church breathed with them, and the Reverend wrote another number and shut the book with care. Across the road, a carter watched from the dark of a livery barn as the last candle went out and the lock turned. He saw a tall shadow pass the panes and did not call out because the night made all quiet look holy. By morning, the paths would be smooth again. The choir would gather after supper. The village would sink deeper into its hush, trusting the patient hands that set children in rows. Under the floor, unseen, wood waited on hinges, and in the silence that followed the final note, something like a breath rose from below, and no one asked where it came from. Father Alastair Craik's voice never seemed to belong to the cold. It was warm but steady, like water poured without a ripple, reaching every ear in St. Augustine Parish without strain. In a village where the war's telegrams carried news of limbs lost and sons buried in far-off fields, his gentleness was a kind of shelter. Parents trusted him without pause, sending their boys to the choir loft as though into a sanctuary. He walked with a measured pace, coat buttoned to the throat, eyes always meeting those who greeted him, never lingering too long, never too short. To the casual eye, he was the image of discipline and devotion. Yet there was a precision to his manner that made even his kindness feel deliberate, as if each smile and each nod had been placed exactly where it was meant to land. During rehearsals, he did not simply correct a boy's pitch. He would step close, lay a hand just between the shoulder blades and guide the chest upward, listening to the breath, though the sound of air mattered more than the hymn itself. Mothers said it was care. The boys, though, learned to stand straighter when he came near, as though their bodies sensed something their minds could not name. He kept a leather-bound ledger with him always, its pages smudged at the edges from years of being opened and shut. Between verses, while the organist flexed his fingers, the Reverend would dip his pen and mark a line of numbers beside each name. He did not write notes about voices being sharp or flat. Instead, he measured pauses between inhalation and exhalation, the depth of a note sustained, the tremor that came when the lungs began to ache. He moved boys along the line as though arranging instruments, shifting them by inches, turning their heads slightly toward the altar or the windows, until their tones blended into something only he seemed to hear. The war outside the village walls gave him cover for his changes. With the men away, few had time to wonder why rehearsals stretched later into the night, or why certain boys were called to the vestry after the others had gone. Behind the heavy oak door, he lit a single lamp and instructed the chosen ones to stand still while he circled them, fingers tracing the shape of their throats, noting where the pulse quickened under his touch. He spoke softly, telling them their voices were rare and must be preserved. If a boy's breathing faltered, he would have him stand with arms outstretched until the body found its rhythm again. The vestry smelled faintly of beeswax and iron, the scent settling in the cloth of their robes so that when they returned to the dormitory they carried it with them. No one asked why the Reverend lingered after each rehearsal in the darkened church, walking the aisles alone, stopping at the choir rail to press his ear against the wood as if listening for something inside. The truth was that he was listening, not for a hymn or a prayer, but for the ghost of a sound that had not yet been made, a perfect tone that would require more than a voice to produce. It would require bodies tuned like strings, and he was already deciding which ones. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft enough to hide the narrow prints that led from the vestry door to the rear of the church where no one ever went after dark. Inside, his ledger grew heavier with numbers that no one but him could read. The nights of selection began without warning, folded neatly into the rhythm of winter so that no one could say when they first started. The Reverend would finish a regular rehearsal, dismiss the boys with his gentle blessing, and then, as their small boots scraped across the frozen square toward the dormitory, he would call out a name in that calm, unshakable tone. The chosen boy would stop, shoulders tightening though he did not know why, and turn back toward the dim figure framed in the church doorway. Inside, the nave was already cooling, the candles burning low, their light bending against the frost that crept along the windows. The Reverend would gesture toward the vestry, the air thick with the faint smell of wax and old stone. There he kept a narrow stool beneath a single hanging lamp. The boy would be told to stand spine straight, chin level, while the Reverend stepped around him in slow circles. His hands were steady, never rushed, fingertips pressing lightly along the ribs as if mapping the bones for a hidden pattern. He would ask the boy to take deep breaths, counting silently until the lungs seemed full to breaking. Then he would place 2 fingers at the base of the throat, feeling the vibration of each word as the boy recited a prayer. When the sound wavered, he made a small mark in his leather book, the pen scratching softly like a nail across wood. Sometimes he would shift the boy's feet, adjusting the width of his stance, tilting the head a fraction of an inch, and then have him sing a single note until the room seemed to press inward with it. The note did not have to be beautiful, only pure, unbroken and sustained, until the boy's eyes glistened with the effort. Between these sessions and the next morning, something changed in them. Their singing grew quieter, as though some part of their breath had been taken and never returned. They spoke less in the dormitory, turning inward, avoiding the gaze of others, yet no one questioned it aloud. The war had taught the village to accept absences, to make silence an everyday thing. Mothers believed the Reverend was shaping discipline in their sons, teaching them to master themselves. They did not see the thin lines of fatigue beneath their eyes or the way they shivered even when the fire burned high. And so the nights of selection went on, each boy summoned in turn, each session leaving behind another set of numbers in the Reverend's growing ledger. Outside, snow muffled the world, burying the paths between the vestry and the shadowed rear of the church. Inside, Father Alistair studied his notes and waited for the sequence to reveal itself. The perfect order of voices and bodies that would one day bring forth the sound he believed God was waiting to hear. December 23rd arrived with a sky the color of iron, the light flat and thin as if the sun itself had been locked behind the clouds. By afternoon, the air had grown sharp enough to bite at exposed skin, and the snow began to fall in slow, deliberate flakes that seemed to know they would not melt. In the village, doors were barred early and fires were stoked high. But in St. Augustine Parish, the candles were only just being lit. Father Alistair stood in the churchyard, the hem of his coat brushing the white crust as he watched the boys file out from the dormitory in their thin cassocks, the red sashes bright against the pale world. Their breath rose in small, trembling clouds. He spoke of duty, of preparing their voices for the holy night ahead, and not one dared question why the rehearsal must begin after sunset. They moved in a narrow line across the square, boots crunching in unison, the sound swallowed almost at once by the thickening snow. Inside the nave, the warmth was deceptive, the air heavy with wax and the faint copper tang of the brass candlesticks. The boys were led to their places, and as the organist settled at his bench, the Reverend went to the great wooden door of the choir loft and turned the key. The click was soft but final, and none of the boys missed the sound. The candles threw long shadows up the stone walls, making the saints in the windows loom larger, their frozen faces watching as the Reverend moved down the line, touching a shoulder here, tilting a chin there. Outside, the storm built itself into a wall, the wind packing snow into the narrow alleys, sealing them shut. Within the church, the only sound was the rising, layered harmony of the boys' voices. Alistair's eyes stayed on their chests, counting the lift and fall, his hand tapping the slow beat of their breathing against the leather cover of his ledger. The rehearsal stretched past the hour when the village bells should have rung the call to supper. One by one, the candles on the lower stands burned to stubs, and still the singing went on. The Reverend adjusting the formation by inches, listening for something only he could hear. When at last he raised his hand for silence, the boys stood swaying slightly, sweat cooling on their foreheads despite the cold. He smiled in that small, measured way and told them they had done well, that God's ear had surely turned toward them tonight. As they filed toward the side door, they noticed the main doors remained barred, the snow piled high against them from the outside. The narrow path they had taken here was already gone, erased by the storm. The Reverend assured them they would leave together when the wind eased. None saw the quiet satisfaction in his eyes as he glanced toward the rear of the loft, where a narrow staircase led up into the darkness above the organ, and below it, hidden from sight, a trap door waited for the next step in his design. Beneath the organ chamber, where the stone floor of St. Augustine Parish dipped slightly toward the rear wall, a trapdoor lay flush with the flagstones, its edges worn smooth by decades of passing feet that never knew it was there. On this night, with the snow sealing the church from the world outside, Father Alistair moved toward it as though answering a call. The boys, restless and pale in the candlelight, watched him produce a small iron key from the inner fold of his coat. The lock gave a muted click, the sound swallowed almost before it was born, and the door swung open to release a breath of air that smelled faintly of beeswax, damp stone, and something harder to place. A dry, almost metallic scent that seemed to catch at the back of the throat. He motioned for them to follow one by one down a narrow wooden ladder into the dimness below. The corridor they entered was no more than the width of a coffin, the walls slick with age, the light from the Reverend's lamp painting the stone in trembling gold. The air was still, heavy enough that the boys instinctively drew shallower breaths. At the end of the passage lay a room barely tall enough to stand in, lit by a dozen stubby candles set in the cracks of the wall. Wooden stalls lined the space in two neat rows, each fitted with a tall, straight-backed seat and a headrest carved with a shallow groove. Brass clamps hung on either side, their hinges polished from recent use. The Reverend's voice was calm as he told them this was a place where the Lord could truly hear them. A chamber built to catch and hold every tone they gave. He assigned each boy to a stall, adjusting the clamps to tilt their heads just so, the mouths opening without resistance under his guiding hands. From his coat he withdrew a tuning fork, struck it against the stone and held it to each boy's temple, watching the way their throats trembled in response. He made notes in his leather ledger with each strike, measuring not the beauty of the sound, but its endurance. How long a boy could hold a note before the breath began to shake, how the muscles at the jawline flexed under strain. The stalls were arranged so that when they sang together, the tones converged in the center of the room, vibrating in the hollow space like water in a sealed vessel. The Reverend would stop the mid-hymn, adjust a head angle by a fraction, then begin again, seeking the alignment that would cause the sound to press against the bones. The boys' voices grew raw, the notes trembling as sweat rolled down their necks, but his face remained serene, as though he were merely shaping a prayer. When at last he extinguished the candles and led them back up the ladder, the night air of the nave felt thin and cold. They returned to their dormitory with ringing in their ears, a dull hum that followed them into uneasy sleep. Beneath the organ in the dark they had left behind, the air still seemed to pulse with the echo of their voices, an echo that, to Father Alistair, was only the faintest beginning of the sound he had been waiting his whole life to hear. Samuel Brant was the first to vanish. It happened so quietly that even the boys who slept in the same row of bunks could not say when they had last seen him. One evening he was there, kneeling on his mattress to peer out at the snowflakes clinging to the window pane. By the next morning his bed was stripped bare, the thin straw mattress already rolled and carried away by unseen hands. Father Alistair told the dormitory steward that Samuel had fallen ill and been sent home to recover, but no messenger was dispatched. No carriage tracks marked the road, and no one in the village saw him leave. The explanation was accepted without question. In these years, the war took boys away suddenly, and people had learned not to pry into disappearances. Below the church, in the candle-stained chamber beneath the organ, Samuel was very much present. He sat in one of the wooden stalls, his arms resting on narrow armrests worn smooth by countless grips. The brass clamps held his head tilted back at an angle that made swallowing difficult, forcing his throat to remain open. Father Alistair moved slowly around him, the tuning fork in one hand, the leather ledger in the other. He pressed the fork against the boy's throat and listened to the hum resonate in the bone, counting under his breath. Samuel's voice, once bright and clear in the upper register, had changed over the weeks. It was thicker now, as though the effort of holding long notes had packed something heavy into it. The Reverend instructed him to take a deep breath and hum the middle C. Samuel obeyed, his voice trembling as the seconds dragged on. When the note began to falter, Alistair tightened a strap across his chest, restricting the expansion of his lungs so that the sound became strained, raw. He wrote down the exact second the tone broke, then loosened the strap and instructed Samuel to begin again. These trials lasted until the boy's eyes filled with tears from the ache in his chest. The method was precise, and to the Reverend it was merciful. He believed that pain could purify, that endurance could carve away imperfection. In his mind, Samuel was not a child enduring suffering. He was an instrument being tuned for God's own ear. Each session ended with a strange ritual. Alistair would light a pinch of dried herbs and hold the smoke under the boy's chin as he exhaled the last note, claiming the vapors would seal the voice for the Lord's keeping. Samuel coughed against the bitterness, his throat raw, but the Reverend smiled as if hearing a secret harmony in the sound. Days passed in the upper world without him. The choir rehearsed as always, though the absence of Samuel's voice left a thinness in the harmony that Alistair noticed at once. The other boys were told he had been transferred to a parish school in another county, a lie accepted because no one wished to imagine otherwise. Yet among the younger ones whispers began. They said Samuel had sung so well the Reverend had kept him behind to teach him something special, a song only angels knew. Beneath the floor, the truth was simpler and darker. Samuel's sessions grew longer, his body weaker. The clamps left faint bruises along his jawline, the straps thin marks across his ribs. The Reverend adjusted his position nightly, searching for the point where the voice seemed to linger in the air after the sound had stopped, as though the boy's spirit had stepped into the note. Each time he came close, he would stop, close his eyes, and murmur that they were nearly there. One morning, after a night of relentless trials, Samuel did not wake. His body was limp, head still tilted in the groove of the wooden rest, mouth slightly open as though the final note had been too long to bear. Father Alistair stood before him for several minutes, watching, listening, waiting for some echo to remain. When none came, he touched the boy's forehead as though in blessing, then began the careful work of preservation. Beeswax was warmed and brushed over the skin, linen strips wound neatly around the limbs. The mouth was left open, the throat filled with dried rosemary and sage. By the time the sun rose over Bellwether, Samuel Brant was sealed away in a small recess behind the organ chamber, hidden from sight but not from the Reverend's memory. To Alistair, the boy was not gone. He was the first note in a chord that had not yet been played. And upstairs in the nave, the rest of the choir sang on, unaware that the harmony they built was missing a voice that still lingered somewhere below, waiting to be joined by others. The Reverend's work deepened in secrecy after Samuel's disappearance, his methods shifting from simple endurance to something more exacting, something that bordered on the mechanical. The boys were still summoned in the same quiet way after rehearsals, their names spoken like blessings, their small feet carrying them down the narrow passage beneath the organ. But now the sessions were longer, and the purpose more focused. Father Alistair was no longer simply testing the limits of their breath. He was shaping the voice to his own design, bending it toward an unnatural precision. He began each session the same way, by striking his tuning fork against the stone and holding it to the boy's temple until the vibration sank into the bone. Then he would press it lightly against the base of the throat, his ear close enough to hear the subtle interference between the fork's pitch and the child's natural resonance. If the two did not match, he would adjust, tilting the head, tightening the clamps, even binding the chest with a leather strap to alter the shape of the rib cage. This, he believed, brought the boy's voice into truer harmony, stripping away the inconsistencies of the human body. Some sessions were spent on single unbroken notes, the sound held for so long that the room seemed to contract with it. Alistair would pace behind them, counting the seconds in his head, noting when the first tremor of fatigue ran through the jaw or when the breath began to splinter into gasps. Those who faltered were not scolded. Instead, he led them into the correction stalls, narrow wooden enclosures with padded backs that forced the body into an upright posture. A thick padded collar locked the head in place, and the boy was made to hum against the resistance of the enclosed space while a low drone from the organ filled the air. The frequency was low enough to be felt in the bones, a constant vibration that resonated in the chest and skull, leaving the boys shaking by the time they were released. The Reverend considered these stalls his most effective tool. He claimed they could wash the impurities from a voice, scraping away the dust of mortal breath, The boys left them pale and trembling, their throats raw, their eyes unfocused, and though they had stared too long into a bright light. Yet to him, their voices afterward carried a strange clarity, a hollowed purity that made the hair at his neck rise. He recorded every detail in his ledger, the exact pitch sustained, the length of endurance, the tone's cleanliness after the stall. Outside of these private sessions, life in the village carried on in its muted winter rhythm. Parents noticed the boys speaking less at home, their voices quieter, almost delicate, as though they feared using them too freely. Some had a constant ringing in their ears. Others claimed they could still feel a faint vibration in their chests long after leaving the church. But no one suspected cruelty. To speak against the Reverend would have been to question the one man who seemed untouched by the war's chaos, the one who still tended his flock with a steady hand and calm eyes. As the weeks passed, Alistair's experiments grew more intricate. He began pairing boys whose voices complemented each other in pitch and timbre, binding their chests so that they breathed in unison. He taught them to match not just the note, but the very texture of the sound, erasing individuality until their voices were indistinguishable. In the chamber below, he arranged them in arcs, shifting positions to find the sweet spot where the combined tones swelled into something larger than their sum. When he found it, he would stand perfectly still, eyes closed as though bathing in a light no one else could see. The harm done to their bodies was dismissed by him as the price of refinement. He would rub the cramped muscles of a boy's shoulders, murmur encouragements, then tighten the clamps again. Some coughed up blood in small bright flecks that he dabbed away with a linen cloth, claiming it was a sign of the old voice leaving to make room for the new. When the children swayed from exhaustion, he steadied them gently, almost tenderly, as if he were a father cradling a fevered child. That tenderness was perhaps the cruelest thing, the sense that he believed himself a caretaker, not a destroyer. In his private thoughts, Father Alistair was convinced he was drawing closer to perfection. The sound he sought was no longer a vague idea. He could almost hear it in his mind now. A sustained chord that would shiver the air itself, a tone so pure it would pierce the veil between this world and the next. Samuel had been the first note, preserved and waiting. Now there were others not yet silenced, but shaped, tuned, and made ready. One night, after an especially long session, he lingered in the chamber alone. The stalls stood empty, the smell of sweat and herbs still heavy in the air. He struck the tuning fork and held it against the wood of the central stall. The hum seemed to echo faintly, as if the memory of the voices still lived there. He smiled to himself, certain that soon the chamber would be full, the sound complete. Above him in the nave, the organ pipes loomed silent in the dark, their metal mouths closed. Soon, he thought, they would not need to speak at all, for the voices below would fill the church with a hymn no living ear had ever heard. And when that hymn came, it would not end until every chosen boy had given his final breath to hold it. Christmas Eve arrived like a held breath. The sky over Bellwether a deep, bruised gray that never broke into daylight. Snow had fallen through the night and into the morning, heavy enough to bury fences and bend the roofs of barns, muffling every sound in the village. Inside St. Augustine Parish, Father Alistair moved through the nave with a kind of serene urgency. placing candles in precise intervals along the aisles, polishing the brass on the altar until it caught the flicker of the flames. He had already chosen the 19 boys who would remain after the evening mass, though no one but him knew it. Each had been measured, tuned, and prepared over weeks, their voices altered in ways invisible to the eyes of their parents. The service ended just after nightfall, the congregation dispersing into the cold with murmured wishes of warmth and safety. The boys did not follow them. Instead, they were gathered in the vestry, their white robes freshly laundered, the red sashes tied snugly at the waist. The fabric rustled faintly as they shifted from foot to foot, their faces pale in the lamplight. The Reverend spoke to them in his calm, unwavering tone, telling them they would be offering a special hymn to the Lord this night, one so pure it would never be forgotten. None dared ask questions. His authority was absolute, and the snowstorm outside made the idea of leaving unthinkable. He led them not to the choir loft, but to the concealed trapdoor beneath the organ. One by one they descended the narrow ladder into the chamber below. The stalls were ready, each polished, each clamp oiled, the brass gleaming in the candlelight. The air was cool but heavy, thick with the scent of dried rosemary and sage, the herbs smoldering faintly in small earthen bowls along the walls. The Reverend guided each boy into place, adjusting headrests, tightening the clamps just enough to keep the angle exact, binding chests with soft leather straps to control the expansion of the lungs. When all 19 were secured, he stepped into the center of the room, tuning fork in hand. The first note was struck, a middle C, and the sound spread through the chamber like a ripple in water. He pointed to the first row of boys, and they began to sing, their voices rising together in the narrow space. The tone was pure, but he was not satisfied. He moved through the rows, adjusting the tilt of a head, the position of a chin, until the sound shifted into the precise alignment he sought. Then he added the second row. Their pitch matched so perfectly that it seemed impossible they were breathing separately. The hymn began, a slow, sustained sequence of notes that blended until no single voice could be picked apart. The chamber vibrated with the sound, the air thickening, pressing against the skin. The Reverend closed his eyes, swaying slightly, his hand rising and falling to guide the pitch. The boys' faces tightened, their eyes glassy, but the notes did not falter. He walked between them, listening for imperfections, tapping a shoulder here, tightening a strap there, coaxing more from each strained breath. Minutes passed, though time seemed to lose its shape in that place. The harmonics grew, building into something larger than the sum of the voices, a low, resonant tremor that seemed to come from the stones themselves. The boys' chests heaved against the restraints, their lips trembling, but the Reverend urged them on, telling them they were touching heaven's edge. Sweat darkened the collars of their robes. Some voices wavered, and he replaced them with others, instructing the faltering to hum silently, to lend their vibration to the air without sound. One by one, the boys began to sag in their restraints, the strength leaving their legs. The Reverend did not stop them. He simply supported their heads with a hand and guided the others to maintain the chord. The sound deepened, rich and almost unbearably full, until it seemed the walls themselves would crack. The candles flickered wildly, shadows jerking across the stone. When the first boy collapsed completely, his voice breaking into silence, Alistair eased him from the stall and laid him on the stone table at the edge of the chamber. His hands moved with deliberate care, arranging the limbs neatly, turning the face toward the ceiling. The hymn did not stop. Another faltered, then another, their bodies giving way under the relentless strain. Each was placed beside the others, white robes pooling on the cold surface, the faint smell of sweat and herbs rising with the steam from their skin. By the time the final note faded, the 19 lay in perfect stillness, their chests unmoving, mouths slightly open as though they might take one more breath. The Reverend stood in the center of the chamber, his eyes wet, his voice trembling as he whispered that the sound had been almost perfect, almost. He moved among them, touching each forehead, murmuring words of thanks as though they had been willing sacrifices in a holy work. Above, the church was silent, the snow still falling, covering every path that might have led away. The world beyond the stone walls would not hear the hymn that had filled this place, nor would it know the price paid to reach it. In the darkness beneath the organ, Father Alistair began the work of preservation, the first careful steps toward ensuring that the voices would remain even if the bodies could not sing again. The storm outside had grown heavier through the night, sealing Bellwether in a soundless white tomb. By the time the parishioners began to arrive for midnight mass, the churchyard was a narrow corridor carved through drifts taller than a man. They entered stamping snow from their boots, shaking the cold from their shoulders, their breath lingering in pale clouds beneath the high nave. The choir loft, draped in shadow, stood empty above them. When asked quietly about the boys, Father Alistair answered with a gentle smile, saying they were preparing a special entrance and would join the service in God's time. His calm was unshakable, his voice as steady as the candle flames lining the aisle. The Mass began in the usual solemn order, the murmured prayers and chanted responses echoing softly off the stone. Yet something was different in the air, a faint vibration just at the edge of hearing, like the low hum of a distant storm. It came not from the organ's tall pipes, which sat dark and silent, but from somewhere deeper beneath the floor itself. As the Reverend's words rose from the pulpit, the sound swelled slightly, enough that a few in the pews exchanged glances. When the first hymn was played, the organ's tones were low, drawn out in a minor key that seemed to drag the heart downward. Between the chords, a strange thing happened. In the brief silences, it was as if other voices tried to press through, muffled and far away. A few parishioners later swore they had heard words in those moments, syllables blurred by stone and distance. Others dismissed it as a trick of the mind, the result of cold and exhaustion. But all agreed that the music felt heavier than any they had known before, as though the very building was carrying the sound in its bones. The Reverend kept his gaze fixed on the altar, his hands moving over the keys with measured precision. There was no urgency, no flourish. Each note seemed placed exactly where it belonged, as if following an order written long before the service began. The hum beneath the floor rose and fell with the music, never breaking. Always there, like a second choir hidden from sight. Halfway through the Mass, a small girl in the front pew began to cry softly, her eyes fixed on the shadows near the organ loft. Her mother hushed her, glancing upward, but saw nothing unusual. only the carved railing and the unlit candles waiting for the boy's grand appearance. Still the child would not look away, her little hands clenching the pew rail as though bracing herself against something unseen. The final prayer was spoken without the boys ever appearing. The Reverend offered no explanation beyond a quiet assurance that their voices had already reached heaven tonight. The parishioners filed out into the snow, their talk hushed as though the air itself demanded silence. Some remarked on the strangeness of the Mass, on the absence of the choir, but their questions dissolved into the cold. In Bellwether, curiosity often froze before it could take shape. When the church was empty, Father Alistair extinguished the candles one by one, the shadows gathering thick in the nave. The last sound before the final flame went out was not the wind, nor the creak of old wood, but the faintest echo of a sustained note rising from beneath the organ. A note that lingered too long to be carried by breath alone. He closed his eyes and stood listening in the dark until even that faded, leaving only the deep, waiting quiet. Outside, the snow erased the last footprints from the church steps, covering the night's events as completely as if they had never happened. The village slept, the storm their blanket. But under the stone floor, 19 still forms lay in their white robes, their final breaths woven together in a harmony no living ear would hear again, except for one man who carried it in his mind like a sacred possession, certain it was only the beginning. By the time the snows began to thaw in early spring, Bellwether had almost stopped speaking of the missing choir. The war had claimed so many lives in distant places that the loss of local boys, while strange, was folded into the same quiet grief that touched every home. But when the ground softened under the first warm rains, the churchyard began to change. In the patch of earth behind St. Augustine Parish, just beyond the oldest graves, the soil buckled in small, unnatural mounds, as though something beneath had pushed upward against the melting frost. It was a sexton, Peter Mallory, who first noticed them. At first he thought frost heave had shifted the stones. But when he prodded the ground with the tip of his spade, it sank far too easily. The earth still damp and loose beneath the thin grass. He began digging to set it right, his hands working quickly, but before he had gone a foot down, the spade struck wood. What he found was not a coffin nor anything like the burial chests he was used to. It was a narrow wooden stall, much like a seat, with iron fixtures still gleaming under the dirt. He called to the other workers, and together they unearthed a sunken stone doorway nearby, half hidden by years of moss and the spreading roots of a birch. The entrance led down a short set of steps into a low, cold cellar. The air inside was dry, still heavy with the faint perfume of herbs and candle smoke. The sexton's lantern revealed a room lined with 19 wooden stalls, each identical, each fitted with the same brass clamps and narrow headrests the Reverend had used in the chamber beneath the organ. But here the stalls were occupied. In each sat the still form of a boy, white-robed, their sashes perfectly tied. Their skin had the pale, waxy smoothness of preservation, the sheen of beeswax catching in the lamplight. Linen wrappings bound their limbs beneath the robes, and their heads were tilted back in identical repose, mouths slightly open as if about to sing. Inside each throat was a neat packing of dried rosemary and sage, pressed so firmly that the herbs held their shape when touched. In the right hand of every boy lay a small brass tuning fork, the prongs resting against the curve of the palm. The sight was too precise to be mistaken for hurried burial. It was arrangement, deliberate, careful, as though placed for display. None of the bodies showed signs of decay. The air was cool, the earth sealed tight around the room, protecting them through the long winter. Even their hair was neat, combed as if for a final performance. Word of the discovery spread through Bellwether by nightfall. The church was locked and a constable stationed at its door. But people gathered in small knots at the edge of the yard, speaking in low voices about the strange preservation, the unnatural stillness of the boys. Some crossed themselves when the details reached them. Others refused to believe what they'd heard. But the sexton's face, pale and rigid, left no room for denial. When Father Alistair was told, he did not resist. He stood in the vestry with his hands folded before him, listening to the constable's account of the cellar's contents. His only reply was that the boys had been kept safe for the Lord's return. The constable, unsettled by the calmness in his voice, placed him under arrest without further question. That night, before they took him from the church, Alistair asked to visit the cellar once more. The request was refused, but he looked past the constable to the stone steps leading down. His gaze steady, unblinking, as if he could still hear something rising from below. In the dim of the lantern light, it was impossible to tell whether the faint hum that seemed to touch the edges of hearing was real, or only the memory of the voices that had once filled that sealed room. By morning, the cellar had been sealed, the stalls dismantled, and the boys removed for burial in the village graveyard. But for those who had stepped inside that hidden space, the image of 19 white-robed forms, preserved mid-song, each holding the small brass fork like an offering, would remain as vivid as the day the thaw revealed them. In the minds of some, it was not the stillness of the bodies that lingered, but the thought that perhaps in that dry, sealed air the sound they had made together had never entirely faded. They brought Father Alistair to trial in the county seat, a day's ride from Bellwether in the early summer of 1863. The thaw had turned the roads to mud, but still the courthouse was full. Villagers, grieving families, curious townsfolk from miles around. The air in the room was thick with heat and anticipation, the windows thrown open to let in the smell of wet earth. When he was led in, shackled at the wrists, he moved with the same measured steps he had always taken through the nave of St. Augustine Parish, his back straight, his gaze calm. He did not look at the crowd. He looked only at the table where his leather ledger lay among the evidence, as if reassured by its presence. The prosecutor began with the cellar, describing in detail the 19 stalls, the brass clamps, the herbs packed into the throats. The words alone caused several in the gallery to shift uncomfortably, some turning their faces toward the floor. But it was when the ledger was opened that the air seemed to tighten. The book was filled with neat dated entries, not of hymns learned or rehearsals kept, but of times, measurements, and physical notes. Beside each boy's name were columns of numbers marking breath duration, pitch stability, and the exact second the voice had faltered. In some entries he had written remarks in the same calm hand. Purity achieved, hold extended with strain, resonance perfect for chord. Witnesses were called, the sexton who had found the hidden cellar, the constable who had arrested the reverend and several villagers who recounted his late-night rehearsals, his habit of summoning boys alone to the vestry. A few tried to defend him, speaking of his kindness, his patience, the way he kept the children safe from idleness and vice during the war years. But their voices wavered under the weight of the ledger's cold precision, under the photographs of the cellar stalls taken after the discovery. When it was his turn to speak, Father Alistair did not deny any of it. His voice was steady, almost gentle, as he explained that his work had been for the glory of God, that the boys had been chosen to form a chord so pure it would carry beyond the reach of mortal hearing. He spoke of sound as a bridge to the divine, of harmonics that could pierce the veil between life and eternity. The restraints, the herbs, the preservation, all of it, he said, had been necessary to keep the voices from corruption, to present them as perfect offerings. His composure was unshakable. When asked if he understood that the boys were dead, he nodded once and replied that their bodies had simply given way, but their voices were eternal, sealed in the air of that chamber, still resonating in ways the living could not measure. More than once he glanced toward the gallery as if expecting understanding to dawn in the eyes of those listening. None met his gaze for long. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts, 19 charges of murder. When the sentence of death by hanging was read, Alistair bowed his head slightly. Not in shame, but in what seemed like quiet acceptance. As the bailiff moved to escort him away, he asked only that his ledger be returned to him until the day of his execution. The judge denied the request. In the weeks that followed, the trial became a point of whispered conversation far beyond the county. Some called him a madman, others a fanatic. A few in low voices wondered if he had truly heard something in that chamber, something that had driven him beyond the reach of ordinary morality. But in Bellwether, where the small graves of the 19 were now marked with simple stones in a shared row, there was no mystery left. Only the weight of loss and the uneasy memory of how long it had taken them to see the danger hiding behind a gentle voice. When they led him from the courthouse that final day, chains rattling softly, Father Alistair looked up at the sky as if listening for something far away. Those close enough swore they saw his lips move, not in prayer, but in the shaping of a single silent note. The hanging of Father Alistair Craik took place on a bright spring morning in 1863, the kind of day that seemed ill-suited for death. The sky was clean and blue, the air sharp with the scent of thawing earth and damp wood. People came from Bellwether and the surrounding towns, some out of grief, some out of anger, and many out of the kind of curiosity that only public punishment could stir. They stood in tight clusters around the scaffold, their boots sinking into the soft ground, eyes fixed on the figure who had been both shepherd and butcher. Alistair walked to the gallows with the same slow, measured pace he had taken down the aisles of Saint Augustine Parish, his head held level, his wrists bound in front of him. He did not glance at the crowd. Instead, his gaze seemed to drift upward, as though he were trying to catch a sound on the wind. When the noose was placed around his neck, he neither flinched nor struggled. A witness later claimed he took a long breath, the way a singer does before the first note, and held it. The drop was quick. His body hung still in the morning sun, the shadow of the rope cutting across the trampled earth. The crowd murmured, but there was no cheer, no satisfaction. Even those who had called for his death seemed unsettled by the absence of any struggle, as if the act had resolved nothing. His ledger and personal effects were locked away in the county archives, though the sheriff admitted privately that he had not opened the book since the trial, unable to bear the neat columns of breath counts and final notes. In Bellwether, the parish stood empty. St. Augustine's heavy doors remained barred, the organ silent. The cellar beneath had been stripped bare, its stalls dismantled, the stone walls washed with lime. The 19 boys were buried together in a shared plot on the far side of the churchyard, their graves marked with identical white headstones etched only with names and ages. Families visited often at first, bringing flowers, smoothing the grass, but over time the visits grew less frequent. The war dragged on, claiming more lives, and the dead of Bellwether became a long list that blurred into itself. Yet the memory of the Reverend's work did not fade entirely. Children growing up in the years after were told never to linger near the old church, never to follow a stranger's voice, no matter how kind it sounded. Some swore they could hear faint music on winter nights when the snow lay thick against the walls, a low, unbroken hum that seemed to come from beneath the frozen ground. The older villagers shook their heads at such talk, but they did not go to the church alone after dark. As the decades passed, the story of the 19 became less a tragedy than a warning, though its details shifted in the telling. In some versions, the boys had sung willingly until their hearts gave out. In others, their voices had been stolen, trapped in brass forks, and sealed in the cellar. Only the memorial at the edge of the churchyard held the truth. A row of stones, each one cold to the touch, even in summer. 50 years after the executions, the parish was finally torn down. The land was cleared, and in its place the townspeople built a small memorial garden ringed with black iron fencing. In the center stood a stone monument carved with the 19 names, the date of their last Christmas Eve, and a single line from the hymnal. Let every breath be lifted unto thee. On summer evenings, the flowers in the garden leaned toward the wind, and some visitors claimed that if they closed their eyes, they could almost hear a faint harmony drifting through the iron fence. Historians who studied the case argued for years over Alastair's motives. Some called him a zealot, his cruelty born of religious mania. Others saw in his methods the mind of a scientist, obsessed with the mechanics of sound and resonance, using faith only as a cloak for his work. A few suggested something darker, that the perfection he sought was not meant for God at all, but for himself, a sound he believed would mark him as chosen, separate from the flawed world. In the end, no conclusion could erase the unease his story left behind. It was not simply that he had killed children. It was the way he had done it, slowly, deliberately, with patience that masqueraded as care. Evil in Bellwether had not come with a roar or a threat. It had come in the form of a gentle hand adjusting a boy's posture, a quiet voice praising his effort, a calm gaze that saw not a child but an instrument to be tuned. The memorial garden remains to this day, its gate rusted but still standing. Visitors leave small offerings, a hymn book, a sprig of rosemary, a tiny brass fork. Some come to pray, others to listen, leaning their ear toward the wind as if they might catch the echo of a note held far too long. The question lingers in the air above the stones, unanswered but heavy. How many more voices could be taken in silence before anyone dared to speak? And so the story ends where it began, in a quiet village where snow once buried every sound, and where a man's soft voice hid the sharp edge of his intent. Father Alistair Crake is gone, the cellar dismantled, the stalls destroyed. But the idea that evil can wear a patient smile remains, carried in the warnings parents give their children when winter comes and the nights grow long. What do you think? Could it happen again? And if it did, would you hear it? Or only feel the silence it leaves behind?